Get started. It seems like today was a big day in the war where there was almost a turning point for the humanitarian crisis. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that's playing out in Russia and what the population of Russia feels or knows about that, or doesn't know for that matter?
Sure. Well, first of all, the outcome of the war is, just everybody's surprised, uncertain. The Ukrainians are doing very well, despite being heavily outgunned and outmatched in terms of numbers of soldiers. The Russians have pushed down from the north, the east, and up from the south. They are trying to encircle Kiev, the beautiful heartland of Eastern Christianity. You're asking about the question about the relationship between public opinion in Russia and the war, correct?
Right.
I would say that you have to be very careful not to mirror image the role of American public opinion and see it as working the same way in Russia. In general, public opinion in Russia is less organized, less a force that the regime needs to respond to than a general amorphous set of opinions and values and beliefs, which means that in general, the Kremlin is less constrained by public opinion than is, say, Joe Biden. That allows Putin to do almost what he wants. The second arena in Russia you have to look at is the elite oligarchic KGB and other interests around Putin, who do not necessarily reflect public opinion. And it's those people who Putin protects and also relies on for support, but also he's not as he's authoritarian, but he's not as encumbered by this higher elite than he is by the public at large, if that makes any sense. So in 2014, the initial invasion of the East and also the annexation of Crimea was greeted with a great burst of patriotic enthusiasm that sustained a lot of Putin's political rating for the next couple of years, and that then declined because people got tired of Crimea. It declined because the economy was not great. It declined because of a lot of other things, COVID and so forth. So one could argue that by invading Ukraine 2 weeks ago, that he did it in the expectation that public opinion would rise in a patriotic wave like it did 8 years ago and support him. And that's largely not happened. There is certainly a majority of Russians who support the invasion, but it's not the kind of passionate chauvinism we saw in 2014, which means that that could decline quickly. And you see a number of troubling signs from the point of view of Putin. A lot of Russians are killed already, 10,000 or so, depending on whose counts you believe in. Nobody expected that. These kids were 18, 19. They were largely, a lot of them were draftees. And if you watch the Russian press today, it became clear that the Kremlin was sending draftees who have very little training into battle against the Ukrainians. So Putin looked surprised, and maybe he was surprised, but the Kremlin had been saying for 2 weeks that they were volunteer soldiers going into battle, but it's not the case, and that's going to hurt Putin. So on the one hand, you look at the pretty good sizable protests going on in the last few weeks and say there's a lot of unhappiness with the war. There is, but the majority of the population is sort of patriotic and doesn't get out on the streets, but will be troubled by the fact that the casualties are higher than they expected, and also the fact that the Kremlin lied about draftees being in battle. Now, Matt, that's a long answer, but it's a complicated question.
Thanks. Okay.
Okay. Now, so just a final point. So Putin uses elections to legitimate his authoritarian rule. He doesn't use elections in the way that we use elections here. So you have to be very careful not to mirror image the two systems. Does that make sense? power there, authority there is very personal. It's not institutional. It's not based on the rule of law, heavily based on corruption and money. And that's a very different kind of oil for the machine compared to here.
Yeah, hi. I'm curious about who those oligarchs are and which ones are powerful and could influence Putin. We kind of talked in my group about that. Like, who are the ones that would be influential? Who could take over, like after Putin? What role do they really play in influencing him? Since you brought them up also.
Okay, I think I got the question, but Megan, do you want to repeat it?
Yeah, so the question was around the oligarchs. So who are they? And who seems to be most influential, who could in theory be next in power, perhaps?
Yeah, Russia is essentially a patrimonial regime, which is that money and power are blended together in a way that even in the United States, we have rules about how money in the system works. Russia really has none. So in any given instance, it's not clear whether, say, Gazprom runs the country or does Russia run Gazprom. It's hard to tell sometimes what the difference is. In general, the industrial sectors are heavily monopolized, and the so-called oligarchs, as you say, do run those sectors, but they are not as autonomous as they were when I lived in Moscow in the 90s, where they were really autonomous and underwrote the government. And what Putin has gradually done is put his own cronies ahead of, in charge of key sectors, or KGB guys in head of key sectors. So what you've seen then is a monopolization and consolidation by the hardline, mostly hardline authorities against to control these sectors. Now, if they got rid of Putin, and I think that's unlikely, that means that in this system where property rights are so weak, a lot of people would lose millions of dollars, billions of dollars. And as we saw with the sanctions, a lot of people are losing billions of dollars. But I think it's highly unlikely that the business sectors, which are heavily dependent on Kremlin support for success, will turn upon the power ministries, the Kremlin ministries, who actually nurture them. So if you do that, you risk losing everything. A greater threat to Putin, I think, is from the so-called power ministries, KGB, Interior Ministry. They're like a hyped up version of the CIA on drugs, and those people from which Putin got a lot of his career are more powerful in a way than the oligarchs, and those people are the ones who would probably oust Putin if push came to shove. And they might have other allies, for example, in the military, as happened in 1991. But it's very flexible, and the system is always in flux. And I would say in the past 2 weeks, really for the first time in the 20 years Putin has been in power, there have been signs of overt dissatisfaction with the war, with his leadership. And that's extremely rare. And whether that will result in some move against him, I don't know. But you also have to keep in mind that Putin is sort of in the middle place on the political hierarchy spectrum. There are people who are much more dangerous and hardline than Putin out there, who can have guns, who have media control and all that. So Putin is in many ways not the most extreme, troubling as that might be. And this means that any replacement of Putin by somebody else could well be replaced by someone who is even more authoritarian. So you can't assume that a leadership change will necessarily be for the better, although it likely would be, but it's not a clear thing. So it's a dangerous and unpredictable situation. But as of now, there's no movement against him that I can see. There is just dissatisfaction with his conduct of the war. Does that help? It's complicated, I know. When I'm not reading about the wine country, I spend all my time doing this.
So I'm really interested in how stories are told to justify or explain actions. And so there's stories that Putin is telling, and based on what you're talking about, it seems like he's not talking to the people as much as he's talking to his cronies, the hardliners, or the oligarchs. But what is the story he's telling them to justify the war? Or are they telling him a story to get him to do it? Like, whose war is this, and what's the story being told?
It's Putin's war, but you raise a good question. Think about it in a couple levels. There is a Russian dream about itself as a great imperial empire. Once it was the Soviet Union, before then it was something else. And this dream of great Russianness is something that Putin believes and plays upon. And in the same way, that dream includes Ukraine as an integral part of the greater Russian state. The problem is that Ukraine, especially in the past 15 years, with the rise of a younger generation, with the rise of Western ideas, with the rise of globalization and all that stuff, Ukraine is not the same as Russia anymore, and it never really was. They have a separate culture, separate traditions. They're similar in the way that maybe the Netherlands and Germany are, or Denmark and Sweden, but they're not at all the same place. And in particular, Ukrainians, they're much more European than Russians are in terms of their thought, their attitudes. If you watch the speeches and the films and TV shows the past few weeks, you'll see the Ukrainians are always talking about their land, defending their land. And that's something Russians never talk about. Russians talk about defending the motherland in some kind of dreamy, romantic sense. But so, you know, as a native Californian, third generations, I mean, I think of the United States as probably different than Marylanders do or Virginians do. You know, as you know, Megan, Californians and Texans are pretty obnoxious about their independence. But Russia has trouble understanding that Ukraine is a separate place. And so what the public disinformation campaign that Putin uses is to say it's not a different country, to say it's under the control of fascists, because there was a partisan pro-Nazi movement during World War II, to say it's under the control of anti-Semites and all of this stuff, and it's under the influence of the United States, it's the puppet of the United States. All of this is complete nonsense, complete nonsense. But the Kremlin is very skilled at creating narratives about itself and about the West. You know, the West is a haven of decadent social values and all that. So the Kremlin plays on these narratives to advance its own interests. And one way they do that, effect of that, is that they sometimes have affect an audience in the West, including in Windsor, California, or Virginia, or Washington, who believe what the Kremlin says. And that's really dangerous because the Kremlin is trying to undermine the public narrative of the war or the broader Russian foreign policy. Does that make any sense? So you'll see, for example, people talk about Ukraine is not a real country. Well, it is. It's demonstrably a real country. Or they'll talk about NATO being a threat to Russia, or NATO expansion being a threat to Russia. And that stuff, that's really factually almost certainly not true. In fact, it isn't true. But you'll see these kinds of arguments advanced in various scholarly and policy papers, even in the United States. And that, to some extent, is a success of Russia's disinformation narrative. And that helps. You'll see the talk now about Russia's in Ukraine to protect Russian-speaking citizens. or Russians in Ukraine. Well, look how carefully it's worded. There are no Russian citizens in Ukraine. There are Russian-speaking Ukrainians, but Russia claims some responsibility to protect them. So the entire Russian narrative is really made up and done to advance Russian interests, and it's targeted to specific audiences in Ukraine, at home, and even in the West.
Do you have time for
Email
one more
me
question?
if you have a question about it. What's that?
Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, as long as you want, yeah. Again, on this stuff, you have to be really careful in what you read. And you have to always ask yourself where the author is coming from, where the news media is coming from, where does the Press Democrat get its story? These things make a difference because it's very complicated and it's very easy to fall for myths or untruths or inaccuracies about what's going on.
So along those lines, I was wondering if you could give a rough comparison about the relative strength of the neo-fascist, the Azov Brigade, et cetera, in terms of Ukraine, if you could compare it to the growing, possibly neo-fascist movement in the United States.
Well, you're speaking to a center-right Republican, sir. So what I will say what I think, which is that there's all polls of Ukrainian society show very little anti-Semitism in the country. Ukraine had a terrible history in the past, but Ukraine also had a very large Jewish community in the past, which is now returning to Kyiv. And if you go online and you I think, what's the poll service, the global one? Pew, I think. They had a poll asking every country in Europe, would you want a Jewish neighbor? Would you accept a Jewish neighbor in your home, in your neighborhood? And Ukraine had one of the lowest no rates in Europe. And then that shows, to me, very low anti-Semitism. It was much higher in France and in Poland and elsewhere. So this is one of those Kremlin accusations, sir, that is simply not true because there's no evidence for it. And one of the evidences against it, you disagree, is that.
Well, I'm not making a statement. I'm asking a straight question. Yeah. Certainly, there are some neo-fascists in Ukraine. I'm just wondering if you could compare the relative strength of them, however much a minority they are, to what we now see in the United States.
I don't, Matt, sir, I don't know much about the far right of the United States, but I would say, without a comparison, the far right in Ukraine is actually very small, I think. What happened, what the so-called Azov and other brigades, battalions in 2014 and 15 have been assimilated by the regular army, but there's no evidence that they engage in fascist-like activity. They're part of the regular armed forces. And again, I don't see much evidence of fascism in Ukraine, but it's certainly a concern of people in Moscow. That's what they talk about all the time, but there's very little evidence of it. And I think there's far more evidence of it in Russia, actually. Again, in the United States, I don't follow it in any scholarly way, except to read the newspaper. So the comparison is very hard. But the fascism issue and the anti-Semitism issue in Ukraine comes up all the time, partly because of the Western Ukraine siding with the German invaders during World War II, but that was as much anti-Stalinism, because Stalin had just starved 6 million Ukrainians to death in the 30s, than it is anti-Semitism, but certainly that was there too. So I'm trying to be fair, but the Jewish community in Kyiv in particular has been very supportive of the current government and is very active and in a lot of healthy ways, and the absurdity of the Russian claims about denazification is that, at one point recently, Ukraine had a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister. And as President Zelensky said, I lost part of my family in the Holocaust. So again, if you want to talk about fascism, which is the term a lot of people throw around and sometimes accurately, I don't think there's a lot in Ukraine, but there certainly were self-organized military brigades. Whether they were fascist or not, I have doubts about. Complicated answer, but thank you for the question.
There's a lot of finger pointing politically here at home, and some of it pointing to maybe past reactions to the invasion of Crimea. Can you speak to that at all, as far as, you know, in retrospect, were maybe too complacent in the annexation of Crimea?
I'm sorry, place what with the annexation of Crimea?
Were we too maybe complacent with Russia's annexation of Crimea?
Yeah, USIP, as Megan will say, was a nonpartisan place, but I would say we were too passive in our reaction to a lot of things Putin did between 2008 and the Crimea annexation. Yes, not just the Georgian invasion in 2008, the sanctions and the opposition by the Obama administration was relatively mild compared to the pushback now that Biden is giving it. And the Syria war, which in some ways is a military template for what the Russians are doing now. We had the famous red line, which Obama drew in the sand and then didn't enforce. All of those things, the mild reaction, the non-enforcement of the red line, in my view, probably encouraged Putin to think the US was weak and the West divided, and probably encouraged him to push and maybe be more aggressive to the point where we are now. I just read a Russian commentary this afternoon that argued that Putin miscalculated. He thought the West would not respond quickly. He thought the West would be divided. He thought Biden was weak. He didn't think the sanctions would be as strong as they are. All of those miscalculations, if that's what he thought, he probably did. Those reflect a calculation that the West, as you said, sir, reacted to too blandly in a number of areas, including the Crimean annexation.
Yeah, we can do one last one.
This one's like really general.
Tom, is it okay if they do one more question? It sounds like it's the last one. Is that all right?
Yeah, I'm glad to talk.
I was just curious. I teach middle school, and I think a lot of the kids on social media are just seeing like help the Ukrainians. I was curious, like organizations you'd recommend and like what that could look like at middle school level, high school level. Like, how do you?
What a
support
great question to which I have very little answer. Megan, does Paul Hughes have stuff like that, or do we have it in the building?
Sorry.
There
so
are
the-
huge, ma'am, there are a huge amount of social organizations, especially places like Germany, that are doing a tremendous job, and the Poland has done a great job. The refugees, 2 million more now, can go from Ukraine all the way to the European Union with no passport. All they have is a letter saying it's okay for a year. But in terms of actual relief, if I find some, I will send to Matt. How's that?
Yeah, and I'm just thinking like that school kids could participate.
Yeah, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, which is the Eastern Rite Church, Eastern Catholic version, which is very, very popular in Ukraine, has a lot of churches here in Washington, in New York, and in Europe organizing relief efforts. So in the city, and Megan, that's what we call San Francisco, I'm sure that look for a Ukrainian Catholic Church online, and I'm sure they'll have something. The Ukrainian Catholic Church is loyal to Rome, but has Eastern rites. They are in the western part of the country, and they have been very instrumental in strengthening and creating and disseminating information about Ukraine's tradition, national identity. And that's led by the churches. Lviv, where the country, a lot of places are moving to now, embassies in the western part of the country, is a cultural center of Ukraine. But the diaspora, man, are all over the place. Washington, New York, I'm sure San Francisco. And I would go through the churches there. That's an answer.
Thank you.
And those people have direct contact with non-combat free Ukraine at the moment.